start us off and kind of walk us through what you sent over and where this came from and highlights of the description you've got here?
We've removed the names to protect the innocent. This was a particular legal that I was given a copy of because of Wisdom Wednesdays. And so it's very interesting. I don't know a lot of the backstory behind it, obviously, just because it was forwarded to me. But some of the comments on here really comes down to flavor and style sometimes, right? And then some of it obviously is a little bit of their own jurisdictional flavors, but just some of the comments when I got this and started looking through it, they did, there you go. If you look at number 31, just scroll down just a little bit on the bottom of the screen there. It talks about, they even cite the book on particular things, right? Remove and see section 3-12 of Writing Legal Descriptions by Gurdon Wattles for an explanation on more or less. Right. And so it was just kind of one of those things, like it was rather interesting. And so I had to shoot it to Trent so we could at least talk about it tonight. And then I think if you go to there was one on the last page too, I think maybe even page 2 or 3 or something like that. But
somebody really thinks they are the authority on preparing legal descriptions.
Yeah, man,
that's a lot of style. It's never comment on the style, man.
It was very interesting. Where was there? Oh, it was the Delta angle. Go to the last page.
No, that's kind of outrageous there.
Number 82. Verify the curve data about the delta angles on curves. And how to calculate the delta angle.
What?
Wow.
So our California guys, I see them saying replace document with instrument. Is that a California, or is that more a local county flavor there?
Yeah, it's a local thing.
Depends on the county.
Depends on the county, yeah. Orange County, the instruments, and so
yeah.
I see it different ways, I see D-N-. It'll take document number. I mean, it all depends upon if you label it, or if it's in a legend. I think too. I think some of these are kind of ridiculous that they put for abbreviations and for changes. Because document number, shows up a lot in any land surveying, no matter where you are.
Yep.
Yeah, so our documents are generally called out with an entry number and then a book and page. So that's what we're using. We're calling out, per entry number, whatever, book and page. So that's why I asked, was the entry or document or instrument was local. I mean, add quotation marks was a great one there.
Yeah.
All those.
Wow.
It was interesting when I got my hands on this one. Like, what in the world? So
I like it. Well, thanks for sharing that, Trent, or thanks for sharing whoever sent that to you. That was was great.
Can I ask who added the comments?
The reviewer, the LAPDW reviewer.
Wow.
They spent more time redlining it than anybody writing it.
Hey, Zach, how you doing?
Did anybody check see if they actually closes?
Yeah. No.
Yeah. No, that was all the reviewer. So within the LADWPD. So,
do they have a separate style guide that they use, or?
Yeah. Doesn't look like
Wattles to the extreme.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, one of my other about that area there, not
Yeah.
only is the more or less redundant according to Wattles and stuff like that, but there are two different areas that are given there because there are two different levels of accuracy on that area.
Sure.
I hate
Sure.
it when people do that, when they write it down as acreage and feet, and they say that or the other, because you're giving the reader a choice.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
So it's not one of those things, but that to
So
me, that's
you
more egregious
usually
than the more or less.
is your rule of thumb less than an acre, it'll go into square feet, and then if it's over an acre, that's what I use for my rule of
That's
thumb.
what I use.
Yeah, that's kind of the way it falls, but also it depends on the type of land that you're doing. Because in Wisconsin, if you're doing a subdivision, you have to give the area in square feet, regardless of the size of the lots and that type of thing. That's where it says statutorily. So again, but when you're doing just a regular description, then it's the discretion of the surveyor.
It's pretty common practice to have both in Utah. I generally do that because I don't have to fight anybody on anything for not
Yeah,
saying
but
something.
be sure you use the same level of accuracy for both,
Yeah.
because nothing looks dumber than you go through all this stuff with all these accurate numbers and stuff, and then in the end you throw in two areas that are in conflict with respect to each other.
Yeah.
So,
The other one that I get here a lot is so containing square feet and acres. And then if it's a subdivision plat, it would say it's containing square feet, acres, and 34 lots and 3 parcels. Because the graphic map doesn't say that enough. And then all of a sudden, I try and take that off wherever I can. It's just a practice that's here, but then some counties will reject the plat or ask me to add that to my subdivision plat. And yeah, sometimes it's easier to just put it in instead of fighting it, especially where there's the right thing and what we're studying in Wattles this year, but then there's just get it in and get it recorded and get it over with so that we can move on to the next one. And
yeah, but
not go through the brain dead again.
remember, you're creating a situation that somebody else later has got to try to figure out what you meant by it. So just to appease some guy that's sitting there reviewing all this stuff and doesn't really understand the implications of the wording of the description, to appease that person just potentially introduces problems later on when somebody else has got to try to figure out what the hell did he mean by this.
Yep. Well, I think that gets really great into where we ended last time versus where we're at now. So we got through 3.4 last time. So there's a bunch of 3.12 references in that little red line description we had. So we'll get through 3.12 today. We can maybe pull that back up. And I didn't have it ready, Trent, but where you've got to sneak off, let me get that PDF pulled up.
Perfect.
But the rest of the chapter is all about words, the words we use and the language we use. Find that, find the PDF of the book here so we can.
I can send it if you need it.
Yeah, if you've got it ready to send, so that way I don't have to search through my. I know you sent it to me last week, but I gotta find it in my emails here.
That's okay.
So while he does that, I'll get started here. So words and phrases, and they start talking about latent and patent ambiguities, or Wattles does. So those that are smarter than I am, though I did Google it just to be sure to start the discussion. What is a latent? What is a patent ambiguity? What is the difference between the two?
A latent ambiguity is one that's not apparent until application, where a patent one is obvious on the face of it. When you read it, you see it, there's a problem.
Yep.
A latent one, you don't know there's a problem until you go out in the field to try to apply it.
Perfect. So then he gives us all these ambiguous words that we tend to use and often understand, but they don't always have a clear meaning. So The first ones that he goes through is adjacent, adjoining, contiguous, and contiguity. So regionally, what do you guys use? What do you understand when you hear those? And anything you'd want to pull out from the book here? Those are words I almost never use in my descriptions. Anyone do use those arguments for or against it?
I don't think those words necessarily present a problem in Arkansas. They might in your area. I don't think they do in ours. There's two cornerstones to descriptions, and Wattles dealt with one of them, I think, in the first paragraph he wrote. Essentially that, let me review my notes on that. That the primary thing that a conveyance or deed must do, or land description, legal description, whatever you want to call it, it must identify a particular tract of land. One that's specific, that one that it will identify only a single tract of land. That is one cornerstone that if your legal description does not meet that test, it's totally worthless as a conveyance. It's just a piece of paper. So that is paramount in any description. And the second one, I'm surprised that Wattles didn't mention until well on into the chapter. I think on page 16 he deals with it, and that second cornerstone for Arkansas surveyors, or at least for me, said, I'll paraphrase it from reading court opinions, and that is that a court will give effect to the intent expressed within the four corners of a deed. And so it is the intent of the parties that is controlling. That will overcome all language difficulties. If it surpasses the first test and it presents a means for the court to determine the tract of land that was intended to be conveyed, it's good. And the language might be anything. That's Arkansas.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't use adjacent, adjoining, contiguous. I've rarely ever seen those used here, California.
I've seen contiguous on a couple of descriptions. It's not one that's common or used, but it's interesting to note is we might have this understanding. We use adjacent in our layer styles in our drafting, right? An adjacent property line. And to me, immediately right off the bat, adjacent is it's next to, it's touching, but here they get in, he gets more into a stronger definition. You have seen in different cases this word adjacent used with the intent of meaning that one parcel of land is connected with another parcel, such as an easement with a parcel of land. But since the word in its true sense, meaning lying near or close to, you thereby have a condition where the easement is not necessarily attached to the piece of land to which it is intended to serve. And we talked a little bit about this a couple of weeks ago. Jerry mentioned it just a second ago, is we may understand that right now. We may have, the jargon or just the common use of it, but 50 years from now, someone might grab one of these deeds and the etymology of the word, to use Wattles, is it might change. And so what is adjacent now could very well be more defined as near but not touching 50 years from now. And so are we really clearly talking about what's going on with this parcel.
The only word really that means to touch is a but, and it doesn't even talk about a but. But adjacent, adjoining, and all those are proximity type of words. If you're if you're using those words exclusively to define a course, then you can introduce some ambiguity. But if they're informative with respect to some other controlling terminology that actually defines the course, then it's fine. You know, but to have them stand on their alone becomes problematic. Later on, when he talks about like along the shoreline, that gets to be kind of iffy because the shoreline goes all over the place and that type of thing. And how do you define that to ensure that you don't leave a gap between where the path is and the actual shoreline is?
Right. So maybe these aren't as bad if they are secondary or tertiary describers to what we're trying to put on there, right? The measurements and other bounds might end up controlling. He does say, Jerry, just to kind of I don't know, rebut what you say, he does define the adjoining as, in its again, he says in his etymological sense, touching or contiguous, as distinguished from lying or near to adjacent. So there we go. So that's adjacent, adjoining, contiguous. The next kind of phrases he uses is conveyed and described. Get this all in one. And conveyed is one I see more commonly. Described, no. But I do see, and he'll get onto this, to a parcel of land, and it'll describe the entry number or the document number, right? Often I see described in there, but more often I see just the document number. To a point on that parcel, How about this one? Thoughts on conveyed or described?
I just got a deed in today for existing deed, and it does say being all of parcel 2 described in that grant deed recorded such and such date document official records in County of Madera. We use it out here in California, described.
Yeah, the problem with conveyed is you can only convey what you actually own. If there's we don't like this term unwritten right, but if an adverse possession situation has taken place, then when somebody conveys their property to someone else, they're not necessarily conveying what their description says, but they're conveying what their ownership is based on that adverse possession. So how do you as a surveyor reestablish that boundary, because you're not in that position to determine if adverse possession has taken place? That's a touchy one.
Yeah, and he even has here the end of the second paragraph there. It may be necessary to go to an attorney or title company to get an opinion as to the limits of the land conveyed. But described, that's a simpler one. Here's a document that describes it. We can go to a common line in that sense.
Well, most title insurance policies say that they won't insure for anything the proper land survey would show. So you kind of get into a circular argument with respect to what's conveyed and what's titled, all that kind of stuff. So,
yeah. Any other thoughts, comments on conveyed and described? Now I think we're going to get into the more common used words. So along. See, I saw that we had someone in the chat here. Oh, Teresa shared hers.
Yeah, she said the described. Following described parcel.
Okay. So how about along? Along's a more common one. I mean, I see this almost in every every description. I use it in my description. So in Utah, and we're going to get into this a little bit later, but it's common to see beginning at a point which is bearing and distance from a section corner. And usually the older descriptions say beginning at a point which is north distance and west distance from the southeast corner of section 5. The common intent of that north has typically been north, sectionally north, right? Not a true north, not a whatever, we get into these different norths in just a second, but it's when they say north, your assumption is it's north along the section line. So when I write a new description for something that's clarifying, I often put along the section line to clarify that is my basis of bearings. That is my intent there to give more clarity to what I'm doing at that time. What about you guys? Along?
Yeah, I use along all the time. Almost every legal description has along some kind of line somewhere in it, and you really can't go without using it.
Very common in Arkansas.
And there are some risks, and they get into it in these here. When we're going along something that would be harder to define or harder to describe, right? A riverbank. What is along the riverbank? In the descriptions that Jerry sent over last time we met together, right? There was, what was that along the high water line, right? How do you define that? That along becomes a very difficult thing to describe and use in a description.
Couldn't you use along if it goes along with, let's say, a plat, then it's along the high water line is shown on said plat.
Yep. As described, along is just a kind of qualifier to something that's better defined, right? It's showing you where to follow along instead of some ambiguous, the high water mark that's somewhere at this point in time, right? But if it's defined in a map or another survey, it's really easy to say along that because we have something to follow.
In Arkansas, a high water line would be that statutory recognized line that separates what the state owns in a navigable stream and the private ownership. And so when you say along the high water line in such a fact situation, then you're clarifying that the private ownership extends to where the government ownership begins. And that's a thing that's always open to fact before the court.
Yes, and I think that was the point of the one last time, right? Is it's one that could be hard to find depending on the era, right? If it's a description of high water line from the 20s versus a description of high water line today. But it is, if you're going along some division of ownership for sure. Okay. How about between, by, from, on, or to? I think this is where we can start getting some serious discussion of varying methods, right? To a point, on a line, to the line. And he doesn't give much in the book about these words, but I think there's we could get, if we were to rewrite the book or make some corrections here, I think we spend a few hours arguing back and forth between different regions or methods of writing descriptions.
even though he makes reference to some of the terminology in there, he doesn't really talk about controlling terms versus informative terms. In Brown's book, Boundary Control Legal Principles, they have a whole section in there talking about what are controlling terms and what are informative terms that can help clarify what the rules of construction are, or if you're flipping them over and that type of thing. And anytime you state a condition, an explicit condition, that's a controlling situation. If I'm going to go to something, I'm going to something, I'm going to go like to a monument. I'm indicating that as my controlling point. Or parallel with something. He talks about parallel and perpendicular in that. You're stating a condition that was originally intended to be enforced. So that was a controlling term for defining that particular course.
Thank you. I like that clarification, controlling words, controlling calls. So in this between, by, from, on, to, he states, these words have been cited in many cases as being detrimentive of a boundary by exclusion. When a line in a description goes between or by or from or on or to a boundary, then there is established a limit to the subject property. Under a different situation, however, and he quotes this Leary v. Mayer of Jersey City, the court stated the words to, on, by, at, along a non-tide water stream presumptively carry title as far as into the stream as the grantor possesses. So have you guys seen an example where this might cause a latent ambiguity or confusion? I don't see between often, or even by. I mean, from being a controlling call, being a bearing distance from a monument. To a line or on a line. That often incites some discussion. Thoughts on how to call that or what that actually defines? We're talkative today. Come on, guys. I was hoping we get more discussion out of this. These are the ones that always incite riots at the conferences. So to and on. Let's get into it here. I mean, I'll just throw my opinion out there. I call it to a line. I don't think I've ever used or have rarely used on a line, because I'm using that as a clarifying call, a controlling call, right? We're going to someone else's property. We're going to this stop point, right? Where our deed ends and another deed begins.
Well, that depends.
Yeah, it all depends, sure. But go ahead, Jerry.
Okay, you want a discussion here? Let's say that we've got a senior line that you're going to, and you're going to mark that with a half inch iron pin. Do you go to the iron pin in the line, or do you go to the line marked with an iron pin?
Right. I mean, it depends on if the iron pin is correct.
Okay,
right?
and then of course let's make it a variety and say that the pin and the line don't coincide.
Yeah.
In what case your pin is short of the senior line? Does that create technically a gap? Or because now you have two types of monuments together. You got a legal monument and you got an artificial monument. And generally a legal monument holds over an artificial monument, but was the intent to go to the pin or to the line?
That's where we get into the evidence and procedures, right? Is that pin old enough that occupation is held to it, right? And there's some other further discussions to be had about what's represented or what's held to.
Yeah, but that goes back to how are you going to compose it in the first place? Because that's going to have an effect on how somebody's going to interpret it later on.
Yeah.
What's the intent? Because the rules of construction work two ways. They work for us to interpret the writings when we see them, but they also should affect how we write the description in the first place, because later on, somebody else is going to try to interpret what we're talking about. So if we know how they're going to interpret it, we should be able to write it in a fashion that'll help guide that interpretation.
Yeah, and I guess in my mind, I'm looking at that to answer your question, is I'm looking at it is if I'm reading the description, how am I interpreting it, right? If I read that description and we find this latent ambiguity to the line, on the line, to the pin, pin on the line, and the lines don't match, right? Then I hit pause and we go through it, and we've had this discussion, right? Talk with landowners, get more evidence, try and find what the intent was of that, because they don't match on the ground. Now, let's flip it like you said. I'm doing, let's say, a boundary line agreement or some sort of correction deed to it. I'm writing that in a very different way to be clear about my intent, right? We're going to, both landowners agree to hold to the iron pin and not to the line, right? And so you add clarifying language in there, at least in my mind, that's, bearing distance to a found iron pin, which is now the common line between parcel A and B as described, or between parcel A and B as agreed upon, right? And so then I'm adding as much language as I could, again, saying kind of like a boundary line agreement or a corrective type deed to clarify a new one versus interpreting it. And I say that because I'm actually doing one right now where it's a boundary line agreement, right? We're trying to come up with language that clarifies that. So that's at least where my mind goes. Thoughts? Anyone else want to jump in? Connie? Want to jump into the arguments here?
Well, there's always that old argument, is a point unaligned or in a line. So that's a simple form that I hear people arguing about a lot.
Yep.
And the way I end up explaining that a lot to people is, if you look at basic geometry, if you look at how a point and a line and vectors and circles and other things are described mathematically. So for example, if you look at a description of a line is consist of infinite number of points that are in infinite number of points will create a line, as long as they're in a straight line. A line being a two-dimensional element. So when you have something that's two-dimensional, then the point can be in a line and on a line at the same time, because they're squished in a single dimension. So for a purpose of a line, if you look at it purely mathematically, those two terms should be synonymous. Once you get into a third dimension, if you have a three-dimensional element, when the dimension is no longer squished to zero, then you can differentiate between on a line or in a line. So it's almost becomes, from that point of view, it almost becomes like a moot point. Where you're going to call it in a line or on a line, because it's going to be both simultaneously.
So does the line have width? If it's two-dimensional, it's got a length and a width. So does a property line have?
Well, if it has a width, then it's no longer a line. And then it's some kind of a polygon, rectangle, some other geometric entity.
I like it. I like it.
Well, if it has a width, then it's going to have an area. Yeah.
Yep. James, you had your hand up there for a second. Did you want to throw something out there? No? Okay. I like it. Thanks, guys, for jumping in and just playing around with me here on that one. That's great. Again, the controlling factor in all this discussion is what do we intend to say right now, but what will someone interpret we're saying 50 years from now? So the next segment he's got here is directions of segments versus a whole line. I'm just going to read this whole paragraph. Sometimes you may have reference to an easterly line. Considered collectively, although it has many segments of different bearings, including some which may be nearly at right angles to the north-south direction of the easterly line. The courts have held that a group of consecutive lines with different bearings, including some which oppose a generally north-south line of property, will be all-inclusive within that statement in spite of the fact that there may be some contrary directions. And I use this one, a direction of segments or a whole line. You know, we're going along the easterly line of some subdivision plat that's our controlling line, right? And that may have jogs to it that aren't, you know, northerly or southerly, but it is the east end of that subdivision that we're going along and trying to show the intent of following all those. And the idea being, at least in my mind, is simplifying that description, right? Not making a qualifying call on every segment of that easterly line of the subdivision, but showing an intent to go completely along the subdivision and then proving that by matching bearings and distances.
Right, that's going along annexation lines or district boundaries that I've written, where you're going along that line, these courses, and label all the courses along that line. And so, yep, that works.
Yeah.
I just recently had to write a legal description just Friday that had this very condition, and this is the first time that occurred to me that I want to differentiate that I'm not going along the easterly line of certain tract, but I'm going along the easterly boundary of a certain tract, and then that boundary is comprised of a number of line segments.
So does that easterly boundary get into our conveyed and described if you say easterly boundary versus easterly line?
Well,
with implications in there?
When it's a tract map, at least in California, I can be certain that the tract map imparted a constructive notice and created that line. So at that point, I'm not having to worry about how that's going to be interpreted, especially if I'm writing something that's based off of a record calc off of that tract, which was the case in this particular description. So I wanted to make sure that I described that the intent was to go to that tract boundary as shown on said map. And then I had to follow like 13 or 14 courses along that easterly boundary of the tract. And then I listed all the courses so that you can follow through the description and close on a particular corner. But since some of the courses do zigzag quite a bit, where it would be easterly, southerly, then it zigs back, making it a southwesterly. It seemed like if I call a specific tract line, then I'm introducing my ambiguity between the entire boundary stretch versus any specific line.
So is the track line?
It's a tract boundary. We don't need to say boundary line. When we say tract boundary, I don't have it in front of me. It's going to take me too long to pull it up. But basically, thence along said easterly boundary of tract, yada yada, the following 13 courses, and then I list the courses.
As a map checker, I would not mark you off for that. So that's a style. I look at that as 100% style issue, and if that's what you want for your style, go for it.
No, this is what David's giving her back. That's you missed this, Connie, the first part, but this is what Trent sent over as our. This is what David sent in back. It's not a boundary. It's a line. I'm just kidding. You need parentheses on the exhibit A, please. Parentheses there. Nothing short of perfection.
Yeah. Yeah,
I
no.
I have called the northerly and easterly boundaries or northerly and easterly lines of the subdivision. If we wrap around enough, that makes sense. Say, look, I'm going up and around if it's encompassed enough.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, all the
And
time.
in this particular description, I was lucky because it was an addition to an already existing easement, and the intent was to close the space between the easement as dedicated on that tract and the actual tract boundary, because they realigned something in construction. So in my mind, that clearly outlined the intent.
Okay. Great. Any other discussion about direction of segments versus a whole? I think generally we've been able to agree on that one. That one's a pretty standard one there. Okay, do versus true. So again, this is where I kind of threw out here a common practice in Utah, and I think this is very common in most PLSS states. But you know, if I get an older description that says beginning at a point which is north, and then you know, let's say west from a section corner, it's generally assumed that you know, do versus true. It's sectionally north is what I want to call it, right? It's north along the section line. You know, it's not some other form of north unless maybe specifically called out.
So
Thoughts?
it's not always called out as, like you said, sectionally
Yep.
north.
But if it
It's-
just
it's
says
assumed.
north, I'm generally rotate. My first reaction is I put together my base map in CAD, right? And I
Yeah.
put in the section lines first, and I start punching in deeds. I'm rotating that deed to the section line at first go,
Okay.
which then would rotate.
Do you understand why you do that? What legal reason do you have for doing that? I agree with you. You know why?
Well, as a young guy, my thought process here, and I think I'm fairly close to it, is the old practice of setting up a total station and backsighting north to the section line. It was all relative at that point, and we're not getting into maybe specifics of bearings. At least that's the way I process it through my mind. You know, set up on the east line of a section, face it north, and then start going around versus trying to introduce some sort of mathematical bearing into your setup, and then you just horizontal angle right and around the traverse as you would.
Well, if I was interpreting a description that started that way, I would recognize that the courts will not go outside of the deed to make an interpretation. But what they do, a description must provide a means of identifying the property. And when something is referred to outside the deed, it's incorporated into the deed. So when you say start or commence or beginning at a section corner to identify this tract of land, you have made a call for a monument within the public land survey. And that's on record. And when you make a call for that monument, you make a call for that survey and for the notes. All of that information becomes incorporated within the deed. And on that survey, north is defined by the line that was run on the ground. So there's your reason that you must identify or use north as a mean within that deed as that was established by the public land survey. Now that wouldn't hold on any other type of thing. You have to find that reference outside the deed that gives you a reason to use that particular type of direction interpretation to your description. I hope I made that clear.
No, that makes sense to me. I appreciate you adding some clarity to that. You know, I I understand what you're saying, and I absolutely agree with it. I guess in my mind, I was simplifying more to a process on the ground versus the legal aspect of that. So I appreciate that. I like that idea that yes, it is following, you know, you make a call to a monument, you bring in the map that created the monument and the bearing along that line as it was laid on the ground. So I like that. I appreciate that clarity. Thank you.
I was in a situation recently where there was a lawsuit specifically because of the calls along section lines. This very issue where one deed called east from one corner, and then the deed next to it called west from the corner opposite it. And when you take measurements on the ground, you find that they just passed each other like two ships in the night, and it created a title gap, but only if you take it from the measurements. And one thing that I found that is very relevant is when you read some of the old deeds and you take a parcel, the current parcel, back to patent and then start breaking it down, a lot of the time the assumptions that people were making were based off of the GLO maps, or they were based off of the assumption that the section was perfect, everything was cardinal, and you're exactly half a mile from corner to corner. And if you make that assumption and you plot everything in this particular case, it proved true. Everything matched. There was no gap, no overlap. So, you know, there is an important thing here to mention that when we're evaluating a title record and trying to determine if two contiguous parcels, two adjoining parcels share a common line, that's a title question, not necessarily a survey question. Locating the parcel on the ground is then a survey question, but that should be part of the analysis, is understanding that sometimes north, south, east, and west are assumed to be cardinal because the original deeds made the assumption that everything was cardinal as well. And then, of course, when you come in and retrace it, then you'll do your rotations to section lines and such, so that they're following a measured location rather than just a hypothetical one. So just a comment that I came up against within the last year.
I think you've hit something that I've just recently experienced, Jeremiah. This is up in Syracuse by Schneider's Bluff. Jeremiah is another Utah surveyor that I work with closely, and so this is up near Schneider's Bluff in Syracuse. But this is one of those, like you're saying, one went from the east and one went from the west, and it's created this remnant strip that sits in here. This is one owner here, this larger one. This is the same owner. This is owned by the LDS Church, but because of the way the descriptions were, the county split it 8 feet here and the rest of it here, and created a gap here between common owners, both being the LDS Church, because of kind of what Jeremiah is saying, two different directions and interpretations off of section corners that are not, 2640, 5280, which was an interesting, trying to clean up the title, and that's been a fun little problem there. But certainly some things to take into account when we're looking at the language and the intent, right?
I encountered somebody recently teaching at a seminar saying that if it says north and it's capitalized, they meant north 00 direction exactly, versus if they're just saying north in a context of another description, like would be the case here, referring to the section, then they intended to follow the sections and what we just talked about.
This is my little quirk, but if I'm going along a section line, this came from a mentor of mine too. He's drilled this into me, but section lines are the only lines that are north, south, east, and west. Any other line is westerly, northerly, but but section lines. And I don't know where he got that from, but that's one thing he's kind of drilled into me. So when I write or read it, I mean, there's the quirks and the style points, if you will, but that's one thing that was drilled into me from early on.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that makes sense. I do something kind of similar. Unless something is going exactly north 0 degrees, minutes, and seconds, I will always call it northerly, easterly, so that
Yeah.
there's no confusion.
Yep.
Generally, when you're talking about cardinal, I mean, with the capital and all that kind of stuff, generally that's with respect to a cardinal reference, and you use that for a bearing, north 30 degrees east, means off the north end of the meridian, an angle to the east or to the west. That's really the only time you should use north with a capital N or that type of thing. Northerly is generally a safer way to refer to stuff like that as an informative term. And he has a diagram in there later on in the book that I use all the time. And that is northerly represents a range of angles, about 45-degree range. So that it's informative. It tells you, like, when you go to a road, which way along the road do you go? Do you go easterly or do you go westerly with respect to it? It's the road that actually controls your explicit direction, but which way along the road, that's where your general directions come into play. So any of these people that say, well, if you say north, that means exactly 0 degrees, 0, based on what? True astronomic, geodetic grid, what? I mean, there's a lot of norths out there, and there's always the big one, assumed north, which is assumed to bear such and such and that type of thing. So that's always an iffy one. That's why you always want to state your basis for your bearings or your basis for your directions.
I think that's something we ought to bring up. And I'm only just a couple more chapters ahead of us, but that's one that I want to discuss at some point in this book of putting basis of bearings in descriptions, because it's rare in PLSS states that I see that put in, but it's a critical thing to add. There's a lot of clarity that gets added in with that.
What I've historically found is one of the hardest things to teach to both students and practicing surveyors is how to deal with declination and magnetic bearings and stuff, and how to convert back and forth between true bearings, magnetic bearings, or to go between declinations of in 1860 to declinations today and that type of thing. So whenever you're dealing with magnetic bearings, that opens up a whole nother can of worms.
But if you don't use it, you don't know about it. I would have absolutely no idea. I'd be lost, Jerry.
Yeah,
I'd be looking
well,
to you to teach me how to figure that out, man.
And it's not that difficult a concept, but people
I have
just
no doubt
wrestle with it. It's just.
Yep.
But like I say, you don't use it anymore, so
Yeah, I'm just going to put my head in the sand and pretend you didn't say that, Jerry. So we'll move on to the next. Well, I think Teresa's trying to tell us to move on here, because she's thrown out in the chat here a part of the next section, either. So she threw out here a 20-foot wide strip of land lying 10 feet on each side. Let's reinforce that, each side of a line being parallel with and 40 feet northerly as measured at right angles from the south line of the northeast quarter, the sidelines of said strip being lengthened or shortened to terminate at the west and east lines of said east half of the east half.
This is for a sewer line description, and we see that. So I rarely ever use either. I always use each.
Yeah. And I've got to, I couldn't think in my head, because as I started reading this afternoon to refresh for today, I was trying to think, what do I use? And I was in my head after reading this. I'm like, of course I never use either. That would be dumb of me, but I'm pretty sure I've used either. But he says, on Jerry, I see you raising your hand here. I'll just read this first paragraph. It says, this word is too often used in describing a strip of land as being 20 feet on either side of the following described line. The etymology of the word indicates a choice of one thing or another. So in the above form, it would mean that you have 20 feet on one side or the other side of the described line. Now, if it's a 40-foot strip, 20 feet on each side, then it's I guess it's implied then that the other 20 needs to be equally portioned on the other half of the line. But Jerry, you had your hand up, and then Jeremiah.
Yeah, when I teach this, I tell my students to lay up 2 pencils down in front of them on a desk. And then I say, pick up either pencil, and they'll pick up one or the other. And if I say pick up each one, they'll pick up both. So the point is that when you say either, you're giving them a choice. And they make that choice when they do that, but they don't think about that choice when they write the description. So yeah, stay away from either. Right? It's each.
It's each.
I commonly see it described here often as say a 50-foot wide right of way whose center line is described as follows. And so there is a knowledge there that the right of way must be a 50-foot width, and its center location is identified, which has been acceptable to the courts here. Now that's a different way of going at it. I don't know whether it's any better, but if, you know, I think that if I was using the form that y'all are talking about, I would use the word each too.
And I've seen it written like that. I'll get into an example here in just a second. Go ahead, Jeremiah.
My comment is that I stay away from both of them. I use the word both because even with each saying 20 feet on each side, if it was only a 20, I've seen it before where it was only supposed to be 20 feet, but instead of saying 10 on each side, they said 20 on each side, and it screwed it up. But I think it was more a typo than anything. So I think it means the same thing, but that's just what I use. Is I use both on both sides of the line.
Well, we're in Utah, so it's spelled BOLTH, both.
Excuse me?
I don't know where you've seen that, Trent.
I've never seen it. I've never seen it written like that, but it's sure pronounced like that a lot. I do a lot of work in my county that has BOR pipelines. In fact, there's a Bureau of Reclamation, U.S. It just got dark in here. A U.S. owned pipeline is a 72-inch pipeline that runs from the Weber River down towards Salt Lake, right through the fault lines of the Wasatch Mountains on the east side of the valley. And every single description for that, depending on the pipe type, because there's some unreinforced concrete, some reinforced concrete, and third type, they will say, depending on the type and the situation, some of those are 40 feet on the westerly and northerly sides of the pipe and 20 feet on the easterly and southerly types of the pipe. So I see quite a bit very descriptive language of which side of the pipe. And they've done a really good job of not just saying the easterly side of the pipe, but the easterly and the northerly sides of the pipe if there's any slight angle to it. And that's really great to be able to follow what their intent was, because they've been very descriptive of which side that offset is on. And I think, James, that gets to what you were saying. You described what side the offset is. I see that a lot in some of these older BOR descriptions. Okay. Connie, if you're talking, you were muted.
No, I was gonna say I tend to say on each side of the following described center line, yada yada yada, if that's the center line I'm describing. But to play the devil's advocate, I opened up the Merriam-Webster dictionary as we're talking, and one of the definitions of either says being one and the other of the two. An example given, it says flowers blooming on either side of the walk. It'll make you think that there's flowers on both sides of the walk. However, there's also a secondary definition of the word that it says either means being one or the other of the two, basically saying take either of the roads. You're not going to take both at the same time. So yay for ambiguity.
Right, yeah.
And I don't know the legal if 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 there's been a court test on those words.
Yeah, that'd be a good question. I think that's probably fairly easy to interpret, that maybe not be getting too far fairly often, but next one, accepting and reserving. See this one quite a bit, and I really like the way he explains it here, because these are really quite opposite words that get used in conjunction fairly often, you know. So if you're accepting out of description and reserving it, you're holding it for yourself, or what is the intent of accepting that out? So first couple paragraphs, in the old days, accepting and reserving were used together or interchangeably. This is confusing because of the difference in the meaning of each word. When you read accepting and reserving a roadway over the south 30 feet, does that mean the south 30 feet is cut off from the fee conveyed, or is it merely a reserved right for a roadway? According to Webster, the word accept means to pick out or leave out, or to exclude, or to omit. It is cutting off a portion of that which has been described. Reserving, in contrast, does not mean cutting off, but it means taking and keeping a certain right from part of the whole area which has been given in the deed. Or as the courts have said, in some cases, you give the fee away and then you take back a certain right. Again, referring to Webster, the act or fact of a grantor's reserving some new thing out of the thing granted. By summation, the fee title passes and the reservation retains some right or rights to be exercised over this particular part. Now, I can't say that I've ever used reserving in a deed. I've certainly seen that, and you know, some of that ambiguity pops up. I can say that I've used less than accepting, where I'm completely cutting out a portion of the whole in an attempt to, you know, well, there's probably a number of reasons, but let's just leave it at that, to take out a portion of the whole, less than accepting. Thoughts? What would you guys do? David, would you let that deed pass if I did less than accepting?
I have never heard of less and accepting before. I've never seen that. I cannot say that I've ever seen that here in California before. So accepting, yeah, I mean, I'd let you go on that.
Okay.
It's still accepting is still accepting therefrom something.
Yep.
So yeah.
Yeah, not in a legal description. I've seen reservations of easements being done in other places, but not in a form of a legal description.
Yeah, I think that reserving ends up happening at the title company level, right? We've written a description for some piece of land that gets transferred, or portion of the land that's transferred, and we've been asked to reserve or write some sort of easement or description for a right of way or storm drain, irrigation, right? But I think that language often gets added at the title company level. They're reserving this easement, or they're reserving this right. And it's not something that surveyors are often putting into a description.
Yeah, it's a form of a deed restriction or.
Yep. So Jerry just threw in the chat here. He says, either from Black's online dictionary may be used in the sense of each. Chichester versus Railway Company. This word does not mean all, but does mean one or the other of two or more specified things. Fort Worth versus Rose. So a couple there, but yep, it's ambiguous, he says. Okay, any other comments on accepting and reserving? Am I the only one that says less than accepting, or have used it? I need someone else to make me feel good about myself, and I've used it. Jeremiah, I know you've probably seen that out
It
here.
must be a Utah thing. I mean, less and accepting are two words that mean about the same thing. They're synonyms.
Yep.
And I've only used accepting for fee title questions. Reserving I've used for easements.
Yep. Great. Thanks. Now I feel better that I'm not the only one. Except in the interest of, I'm going to jump down here to front and rear. Front and rear are not satisfactory words to use because of their indefiniteness. The outstanding example of this problem is the application of these two words to a corner lot where you would not know which line would be front or rear. The use of compass direction is preferable and leaves no question. The north and south line of said lot, or the southwesterly and northeasterly lines of said lot, give a clear and understandable position of the lines. I don't know that I've ever even read a description that said rear or front, and I definitely have not ever written anything that's referenced it in that way.
I've seen them and and they are a problem. Big time problem sometimes.
I've only seen it where it refers to the rear or the front of a building, where the building was a bounding call in the description, but it wasn't clear to us because the foundation was all that was left. We didn't know where the door was, but mathematically it fit one of the lines, and that's what we used. But not in terms of the parcel itself, in terms of a bounding call to a structure.
Yeah. I mean, that's where you take this, well, you know, again, clarifying a latent ambiguity. I think this might be a patent ambiguity. If I saw that on a deed, I'd throw up red flags before I went out there. But, you know, the evidence and procedures we then gather into, you know, if we're interpreting that deed, but certainly in writing it. In a straight line, the statement in a straight line is usually unnecessary because the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. An exception might be if you were following a fence line which was not straight and you wanted to be certain that the described line followed on a straight course between angle points rather than the wandering fence. I would still write it to the major angle points of the fence. I might liberties in skipping minor angle points, but I would probably write that to follow major angle points or the intent of the fence. And maybe some qualifying calls in there that says the fence is not straight. The intent of the description or the intent of this call is to follow the fence as laid on the ground at this point. Makes it difficult in the future because if that fence isn't there, who's going to determine that? But if you can get the major points or major directions of the fence, I think that would be clear enough for any general user to be able to reestablish. Anyone use straight? Seen straight? I don't think I've ever even seen a straight line.
Well, I've seen a straight line, but yeah, yeah, good one. Yeah, I've seen it used, but yeah, rarely.
I think saying straight is superfluous.
I agree. Okay, here's a good one. I don't see this all this often anymore. Most of the old deeds always had it, but I think we've gotten smarter than it. More or less.
I think that's implied in every description in every course.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not even using, if I'm doing a record versus measure type call, you know, I'm not saying more or less along the line, record measurement being, you know, I might call out the difference between the two, but you know, again, it's implied in the call, particularly if you have a call to a natural artificial monument, right? You're going to that, you're going to the qualifying call, to the line, to the point, to the whatever.
Yeah, I agree. We've gotten smarter with that. And yeah, exactly what you said, Trent. We used to see that all the time in the older legals, but now I can only think of one time that I've ever used more or less, and it was only because it was a really ambiguous line that I was going to. Yeah, rarely see that now.
Well, I still see it all the time in Arkansas as pertains to proportional land areas of the public land survey, which is it puts the grantee on notice that the acreage that was shown on the GLO plat is probably in error and it might be significant. So he is well aware that, although, it might be described as 40 acres, it might be 42 acres, or it might be 38 acres. And I think that serves a public purpose. But outside of that use, I haven't seen it and I wouldn't want to see it.
So before Jerry speaks up here, Teresa just threw in the chat, containing 6,557 square feet, more or less. So I mean, what are we less a square foot? You know,
Correct.
more or less that much. Thanks, Jerry. Go ahead,
Half a
Jerry.
foot. Yeah.
That's the only time I ever
Half a
use
foot,
more or
yeah.
less is at the end of a easement to put in area. That's it. That's all.
Let me show you a blend of technology and more or less. If I could share my screen, please. Let
Go
me
for it.
show this. Hey, can you see this description?
Yep.
This was just recently recorded in Wisconsin. If you read that description, you can tell it's not written by a surveyor, but it was written by somebody that has access to some sort of GPS. So he's going 296 feet more or less to GPS waypoint, latitude and longitude. So here we got a blend of modern technology, GPS, who knows what datum, to what level of accuracy on those, and the controlling term on each one is a waypoint, which is the same thing as saying to a point, but more or less is scattered throughout there also. So I just thought that was kind of an interesting. So we do see it. It's not surveyors are doing it, but we do see it.
I like it. I like it. Thanks, Jerry.
I actually have a question on acreages expressed. I understand putting more or less on the nominal acreages in public lands, but when we're doing a parcel of land or an easement or something and calculate the area and then put down more or less after the area that we calculated, why do people put more or less next to the area that has been calculated, where we have exact line work that we calculated it from?
That's really redundant to put that on there, because when you look at the rules of construction, area is right at the bottom of the list anyway. So putting more or less on there is superfluous. Putting approximately on there, you don't really need that.
Yeah, that's kind of the way I always look at it, because I'm going, but why put on more or less? Are you uncertain in your calc, or what? What are we trying to say by that, by this?
Well, and it's rare. It's probably rare that we have descriptions for writing that don't close within some nominal amount, right?
Right.
When we were doing something in chains, there was some inherent error in the area because we may not have been closing within some certain, again, tolerance of the time. But anyone writing a deed today is generally closing that deed to some measurable amount. And so your area is likely not to be a significant point of error. And again, to both your points, in the rules of construction, that's the lowest of it. So why does it matter? It is kind of redundant. It's implied anyways in anything we do, error in measurements, but then to include that we're not writing stuff that poorly anymore.
Well, at the end of the day, the assessor is going to cut off everything but the last two decimals and make it a more or less anyway. And that's what you're taxed on. They're not going to go to a precise square footage like your line work would suggest either.
Yeah.
Yeah, I heard arguments. I heard people say that, oh, I'm writing this, but I don't know what the future interpretation of this boundary is going to be, and it's going to change a little bit. But you're not attesting to the area of what it's going to do in the future or by some other interpretation. You basically just giving them an easy number so they don't have to calculate themselves. So it's a derivative number from your work to start with. Unless somebody has written a completely bounded by description and is doing all the adjoiner calls, and you're not necessarily always certain of a geometric location of a specific line, it's still possible to write a legal description without having a field survey attached to it, and that it's conceivable that the area actually does have uncertainty. But I don't know that a prudent surveyor would actually go and do something like that. So this is more of just a theoretical exercise to mention it.
Yeah, and Jerry, just for the chat here, that traditionally that can date back to when surveys used to just close out the legal description, thence back to the point of beginning, you know, and
Without the last course.
without the last course, we're calling out that last course. I mean, almost exclusively now, right?
Yeah.
Great discussion. So parallel to, parallel with, perpendicular to. I can't ever remember what we're supposed to do here. So I don't use them. How about that? Equidistant from?
No, I use parallel with all the time. Perpendicular to, because you're going to a line. Parallel with, you're never going to that line. So you're never really touching it. But I will always say to a line parallel with and so many feet distance measured at right angles.
Equidistance and measured at right angles, because we really want to be superfluous there. Like,
well, it's been beaten into me to mention measured at right angles, because we've actually had people interpret parallel with a distance different than measure at right angles. I don't know what would possess them to do that, but
yeah. Teresa threw that back in the chat. A 20-foot wide strip of land lying 10 feet on each side of a line being parallel with and 40 feet northerly as measured at right angles. I did like that. The other one you threw in there, you know, being clear in our intention, right? The sidelines, it says strip being lengthened or shortened as to terminate at the point of beginning and point of termination. That's the way I write it. But I've seen it, you know, at the east end and the west end, or some other combination of that. But I can't even spell parallel, to be honest with you. And this is going to be on record for the rest of my life on YouTube. Thanks, Trent Keenan. But I want to put 2 R's in parallel every time I spell it. So yeah, let's just leave it at that.
well,
That's what
putting
spell
2
check's
L's
for.
at the end, you know, it gives it a little extra flair.
Come on,
Right.
spell check. That's what spell check's for.
That's what spell check's for. That's right.
We don't
I
worry
told
about
you,
that
I think I
anymore.
said this last week.
Yep.
English is not my language. Like, that is the last thing I should be doing, is writing anything. So, point. I think we talked a lot about a point here.
Sorry.
Oh,
I
go ahead.
finally know how to spell a committee, because I'm on several now.
Uh-huh.
Maybe you should start writing parallel lines, Trent.
Probably ought to. I
Parallel
don't know that
straight
I've really
lines.
had many chances. When I was in the utility industry, when I was doing power line utilities, it was common to write some sort of strip easement. But we'd simplify that to, you know, the southerly 20 feet or the easterly 20 feet. Instead of being called out parallel to, we were calling it out as a portion of the original parcel. Because generally speaking, I'm going to say generally speaking, that's where that parallel line falls. There's certainly times where it's not along a property line, it's offset from. You know, I've seen that where you've got a sewer line that's a 20-foot sewer easement 40 feet off the line. So you got property line 20 feet and 20-foot easement, right? Or something like that. Or some, you know, to a point, we've talked a lot about a portion. We talked about this, I don't know if it was last time or the time before that, but a portion of the property. We talked about that when we were getting into kind of our header of the description, right? That portion of the whatever, that portion of the original parcel. Going back to Trent's little thing he sent over, right? This hurts my head, but that certain portion of a parcel as described, and normally I see it a portion of that certain parcel, right, as described. You know, all that flair, but a portion of something, right? Giving clarity to what that we're taking out of a whole. I think we had some good discussion that when we did this, I think it was last time, you know, that if you're cutting out of a part of a whole, if we're doing like, you know, we gave the example of a phase in the subdivision, right? You're cutting out phase one of the overall portion. So that portion of that parcel described in this being more particularly described as follows. Teresa threw in the chat, a portion of the west 330 feet, of the east 3/4, of the southeast quarter, of the northeast quarter, section 27, township 14 south, range 22 east, county of Fresno, California, more particularly described as follows. A portion of the west 333 feet. So that's super clear.
Of the
Well,
east
it's
quarters.
you know, it's the how you describe what your property is, you know, and then you
Yeah.
describe it particularly taking out that piece. And we use that a portion of more typically if you're doing, you know, temporary construction easements, sewer easements, you're doing a portion of that property. So it's basically a portion.
Yep. And now I'm remembering a little bit the way we got into that discussion last time is we talked about in that header a parcel of land situate again. That's probably another Utah one. Situated. What did you guys use?
Situated, we use that in California too.
Situate.
Situate.
Oh,
Yeah,
situate.
you
Oh.
get that weird
Us Utah
word.
guys. I'm glad Jeremiah is here to defend our Utah quirks.
No, I never use situate. I say located in. I mean,
Located in.
let's talk layman here. We can say superfluous another time in this meeting, but not many people know what that means.
Yeah.
Right. So situate's just one of those words that sounds more like lingo than anything.
That was used in Pennsylvania a lot. We use described as. We start with a caption, then described as, or more particularly described as.
Right. That's it. Yeah.
And I threw the question out to kind of close that discussion. I threw the question out, well, what if it isn't the whole parcel, right? It's a portion of the parcel. So I've changed kind of the method of my approach, that portion of an overall parcel instead of a parcel of land where it isn't the full parcel, right? Or at least not yet. Position, words, figures, and phrases. The juxtaposition of words and figures in a description is very important. Very often, the closeness of figures and words to each other creates a question as to the meaning. If your description reads west along the north line of lot 3, 201.74 feet, does it mean west along the north line of lot 3, 201.7 feet, or does it mean west along the north line of lot 3, comma, a distance of 201.74 feet? So, you know, punctuation. I've got a sister-in-law that's an English teacher. There's a bunch of phrases out there about punctuation, right? I wish I remembered some of them, but you know, you can get yourself into trouble by the pauses and punctuation, how you approach this and what you truly mean. We're out of time. We're at least at the half hour here, but I want to get through these so we can get through this chapter. So prolongation, projection, extension, continuation. We kind of talked about that, extending the lines to the point of beginning, extending the sidelines at the point of beginning, lengthened or shortened at the point of beginning, point of termination. Right or left. I had a discussion yesterday with one of my drafters who couldn't remember if an arc goes right or left. And we had to make this little hand gesture, like what direction is the arc going? Running, although this word has been used for years, it adds nothing to the meaning of the description. it would be well to classify it as verbose and admit its inclusion. I mean, that's about as simple as it gets, but I use it running thence. I don't say running along, like you've run along the easterly line. I don't say running along, but in my caption, I say, and running thence.
You don't just use thence along?
Thence along. No, I think that's more of a company quirk, and running thence. And then you begin your detailed description. Beginning a point which is bearing a distance, and running thence. Said and aforesaid, kind of the same thing. He kind of goes through this. One thing that I have added into my descriptions, again because of a mentor, if I have something that I've said earlier in my description and I need to re-reference it down at the bottom, I don't want to say said, because said is kind of I just said it, right? So I'll say aforementioned, thence along the east line of a section of a subdivision, and then we go all the way down through the description, we're back to that same east line. So then I will reference, hey, this is the same east line I used at the beginning. So I'll say, thence along the aforementioned east line of this subdivision, and try and connect that, hey, these are the two. Again, that was a mentor quirk that's been drilled into me.
What I use here and above described.
Here and above described, yeah. Subject to, I think subject to is probably one of those, kind of gets into our reservations, right? It's probably not a big surveyor's term, but it gets thrown in there a lot at the title. Thereof, accepting thereof, the south 20 feet, 25 feet. And then he gets into relationship between descriptions and surveys. There's kind of a lot to unpack there, but that kind of ends our chapter, as it were. I don't remember anything popping out necessarily specifically to call out and discuss, other than there can be a difference between those when you reference a survey versus the description, how we place it on the ground versus what that description actually says. I was going to point out in this chapter, he uses a lot of the words contrariwise.
On the other hand?
On the other hand, but I guess we want to be fancy here. As surveyors, we use situate, we use bigger words than really the text calls for, so contrariwise. And then we get to the end here. That's the end of the chapter. He's got some questions there, some problems for the class if you wanted to answer those. I know we skipped over the last couple of pages really quick here, but any questions, comments, complaints, things you change, disagree with, agree with?
I'd like to mention something on a couple of screens up where we were talking about the order of words. I found where that actually makes a huge difference. I'm dealing with a lawsuit right now because the description, there was a tie to a historic block corner. Let's say south 1,000 feet, east 500 feet. And then the city took a portion of that corner so they could create a curve for some improvements. But when the description was rewritten, they put the point of beginning at the point of curvature, which was about 16 and a half feet away from the old block corner. But they described that point as the historic tie to the historic corner. And so what ended up happening is it shifted the entire parcel in the mapping by the 16 and a half feet. And the county's now created a remainder parcel that supposedly wasn't conveyed. There's other language in the deed that would have conveyed it, but the description that was created this gap. And so now they're trying to resolve it. And it was all because of the order the words came in. If they would have described the historic corner as having the historic tie, rather than the new point of beginning as having that historic tie, I mean, I don't think they understood what they were doing ultimately. and it ended up causing a lawsuit. So, you know, the position of words and figures does make a difference. And I do agree in this case that keeping the course and distance together in every case is going to be a lot clearer than putting a lot of qualifying information before it and then putting your course and distance. I think it's better to do your course and distance and then the qualifiers afterward, so that you've got a clear break between what the bounding or the meets course is supposed to be, and then what the bounding courses are behind it.
I can guess what county that's in, Jeremiah. I bet I can.
Yes.
The one county that practiced surveying without a license from the recorder's office.
Oh, you mean Utah County?
Oh, well, Davis County too.
No, it's Utah County.
Okay, well, that was my next guess. I got one other quirk when it gets to that, and this is me, and I know title companies generally will do this, but I see a lot of surveyors do this. So if you guys are ones that do this, I'm not apologizing for critiquing you here. A written paragraph like this of description, this is a quirk of mine. I hate it. I like it lined out, every call on its own line. I know it takes up a ton of space, but it adds so much clarity to follow and actually reduces mistakes, right? If you're not trying to read through a paragraph where it's all clumped together and you can read it line by line and see the call with the bearing and distance and everything qualifying in a neat, you know, linear format versus a paragraph format. That's my 2 cents right there. I stand by that. Just don't write legal descriptions of paragraphs anymore.
Well, if you want to kill a tree
Yeah.
with all that paper that you're printing out there with all those words, then you go for it, young man.
I'm happy to kill a few trees for that reason
Wait,
alone.
Wait,
I'll plant a couple in my yard to make up for it.
we don't use trees to make PDFs anymore.
Thanks,
Come on,
Connie.
Connie, you got to help me out here. Jeez.
Sorry.
Shoot me down.
I'm in Trent's camp on this one. I cannot stand sausage legal descriptions because, and I between that and some of the drafting stuff that I teach my people, I constantly tell them, if you present something in a way that it leads to errors, then you're contributing to it not being technically correct. Because if you know that people are going to interpret something consistently, make mistakes, then it's your responsibility to change how you're presenting things so that your product is as free of error as possible. And that includes other people's interpretation.
See, I'll often write them as the sausage description so I can see the course like Trent says, and then I throw the sausage in the jambalaya with everything else. And make a paragraph.
Yeah, no, I have a tiny little bit of dyslexia and I will misinterpret these all the time. It'll take me 3 times as long to calc them out or read them or do anything with them.
Okay. Well, and I just realized when I was looking at this a little closer, just trying to find what the heading for chapter 4 is, he stuck some stuff on the back end of this I didn't even reread today. There are more questions, but there is a last page, 320 and 321 here. So some more stuff to go through and clarify, but then in 2 weeks, determination of what controls. Jerry started our conversation off today talking about those controlling calls. And I think this will be a great little discussion there of writing descriptions. I think we've been able to jump back and forth between writing and determining, and this is really going to help us be better writers, determining what controls.
We get into your bases of bearings, your favorite part.
Yep. Bearings plural, please. Another little thing there. So.
And your general directions, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I appreciate you guys. This has been great. We'll see you in 2 weeks.
All right. Thank you, Trent.
Yeah, thanks,
Absolutely.
guys. Have a good night.
Right.
Good night.
Good night.